In the dim glow of a flickering fire, an elderly priestess stood before a small cradle, her gnarled hands raised to the heavens. Her voice, raspy and filled with ancient power, echoed through the temple as she whispered a prophecy to the newborn girl lying within. "Sahure," she intoned, the name trembling with both reverence and fear. "Beauty beyond mortal sight, a gift from the gods, but it shall be your curse. You will bring madness to those who gaze upon you, and those who love you shall be lost to fate." The child, innocent and unaware, cooed in her sleep, her face radiant and flawless, untouched by time. The wind howled outside, as though the gods themselves were listening, waiting. The priestess's heart beat with an unsettling certainty that the prophecy was no mere vision. It was destiny itself, woven into the very fabric of Sahure's soul. As Sahure grew, so did her beauty. It was a wonder to behold a flawless face that seemed to shine with an ethereal glow, her eyes deep pools of mystery, and her lips a perfect curve of allure. Men from distant lands, drawn by tales of her beauty, would come to lay eyes upon her, only to find themselves ensnared in an unrelenting obsession. One by one, they would fall victim to madness, their minds consumed by thoughts of her. Some sought her favor with gifts, others with poetry, but none were ever enough. Their lives became twisted by an all-consuming desire, and many were driven to ruin. Some took their own lives, while others met tragic ends in their pursuit of a love that was forever out of reach. Sahure could not escape the power her beauty held over them, nor could she escape the whispers that followed her everywhere. People called her a goddess, a curse, and a weapon, each word echoing with both awe and dread. The gods had chosen her for a fate far beyond that of mere mortals. But what good was such beauty when it destroyed everything it touched? Sahure began to understand. The weight of the prophesier beauty would be her undoing. Sahure's beauty was both a blessing and a curse, a force that commanded attention even in the simplest moments of her village life. As a child, elders would stare at her in awe, whispering that she was not born of mere mortals but sculpted by the gods themselves. Women clutched their sons and husbands tighter whenever she walked past, as if afraid that a single glance would steal their hearts. And it often did. Boys barely older than she would stumble over their words in her presence, their eyes dazed, their hands trembling. As she blossomed into womanhood, the consequences of her beauty became undeniable. A young fisherman, desperate to win her love, drowned himself in the Nile when she refused his advances. A merchant's son, having glimpsed her only once, abandoned his family's wealth and wandered the desert, calling her name until the sand swallowed him whole. The villagers began to fear her, and though no fault lay in her hands, they whispered that she was cursed. Mothers spat at her shadow, fathers muttered prayers when she passed, and men who once longed for her now cowered in fear of what she might unknowingly do to them. Love was a poison, and she, the unwilling vessel of its madness. The whispers of her beauty traveled beyond the village, spreading through the great cities of Egypt until they reached the ears of Pharaoh Amenhotep himself. A ruler who had everything: power, wealth, and dominion over the greatest kingdom in the world, found himself intrigued by the idea of a woman so enchanting that men would surrender their very souls for her. Could such beauty truly exist? He summoned his most trusted messengers and commanded that Sahure be brought to the palace. When the royal envoys arrived at her village, the people offered no resistance. They were relieved to see her go, their fear outweighing any affection they may have once held. Sahure, with no choice but to obey the will of Pharaoh, left behind the only home she had ever known. As she rode in the grand chariot toward the heart of the kingdom, the weight of her fate settled upon her. She was leaving behind one prison only to step into another one with walls gilded in gold, but a prison nonetheless. The moment Sahure stepped into the great hall of the palace, a hush fell over the court. Ministers, generals, and nobles alike turned their heads, their breaths caught in their throats. Even in the grandeur of the royal palace, among the most dazzling treasures of Egypt, Sahure shone like something otherworldly. Draped in fine silks, adorned with delicate gold jewelry, she seemed less a woman and more a vision of the divine. Pharaoh Amenhotep rose from his throne, his piercing gaze locking onto her as if he had seen a goddess descend to earth. He stepped forward, drinking in every detail of her face, his expression unreadable. Then, a slow smile spread across his lips. "The gods have been generous," he murmured, his voice filled with awe and possession. Without hesitation, he declared her his sacred consort, a woman who would stand at his side as a symbol of his favor from the gods. But Sahure knew better. She saw the hunger in his eyes, the same hunger she had seen in every man before him. The pharaoh was no different. He, too, would fall under her spell. And when he did, she feared what it would mean for the most powerful man in Egypt and for herself. Sahure's rise in the palace was swift and absolute. The pharaoh adorned her with the finest jewels, draped her in silks softer than the petals of a lotus, and declared her a living embodiment of the gods. Her face was carved into temple walls. Poets sang of her radiance, and noble women adorned themselves in poor imitations of her beauty. But beneath the golden facade, Sahure felt the weight of her curse tighten. Every man who gazed upon her was lost. Pharaoh's most trusted generals bickered like children for her attention. The high priests saw visions of her in their sacred dreams, and servants trembled when they met her eyes. Wherever she walked, she left ruin in her wake. Whispers spread that her presence could turn the mightiest of men into fools, and that her beauty was not a gift from the gods, but a test sent to break them. She dined at the pharaoh's table, bathed in oils of frankincense and myrrh, but she was more prisoner than queen. No one saw heraldly the enchantment they believed her to be. As the weeks turned to months, Sahure watched as the men of the palace succumbed to madness. A general who once prided himself on his discipline fell into disgrace, neglecting his duties to write endless verses of poetry in her name. A scribe, young and hopeful, carved her likeness onto every stone tablet he touched before taking his own life, unable to bear the agony of loving something beyond his reach. Even the pharaoh himself changed. His initial fascination grew into something dangerous, an obsession that consumed him. He spoke of her constantly, canceled matters of state to be in her presence, and declared that no other woman in Egypt could compare. The queen, once secure in her position, was cast into the shadows. Rumors swirled that the gods themselves were jealous, and that they would strike Egypt with calamity should Pharaoh's heart remain ensnared. But Sahure knew the truth. This was not divine intervention, it was her curse, and it was tightening its grip around the kingdom like a viper poised to strike. Sahure sat by the grand, reflecting pool, staring at her own face in the water's surface. The features that men worshipped, the deep, coal-lined eyes, the delicate lips, the flawless skin, felt like a prison of flesh she could never escape. She longed for a love untainted by madness, for a touch that did not tremble with obsession. But such things were denied to her. Every attempt at companionship ended in ruin. Every kind word carried the seed of eventual despair. She turned to Pharaoh, pleading with him to let her go. to send her to a temple where she could live in solitude and prayer. But he only laughed, pressing a jeweled ring into her hand and whispering, "You are not meant for obscurity, my love. You are meant to be worshipped." The walls of the palace seemed to close around her, grand and golden but suffocating all the same. She was not a queen, not a woman, not even a person in their eyes. She was a relic, a thing to be possessed, a flame that men could not resist even as it burned them to ashes. And so, she ceased to hope for freedom until one fateful night when a whisper in the dark changed everything. The high priest of Anubis, a man whose face was lined with the weight of ancient knowledge, summoned Sahure to the temple under the cover of darkness. His voice was low, careful, as though speaking of forbidden things could call down the wrath of the gods themselves. "There is a way," he murmured, "to break your curse." Sahure's breath caught in her throat. She had never dared to dream that such a thing was possible. He told her of an ancient rite, a ritual buried in time, one that could free her from the torment of her beauty, but at a terrible cost. "This is not a simple spell, nor a gift given freely," he warned. "To break one bond, you must forge another. To be free of mortal men, you must become something more." Sahure's hands trembled as she considered his words. She did not ask what the price would be. She did not need to. The gods did not grant freedom without sacrifice. And in her heart, she knew whatever it took, she was willing to pay. The temple was silent, its torches flickering as if hesitant to bear witness to what was about to unfold. Sahure stood before the altar of Anubis, her heart pounding as the high priest arranged sacred relics in a precise, ancient pattern. The air was thick with incense, the scent cloying, intoxicating. In the dim light, the priest's voice wove the incantations that would unbind her from the curse but bind her to something far greater. "You will no longer be a mere woman," he warned as he traced symbols upon her skin with blackened ash. "The gods will not release you without claiming you for themselves." Sahure did not flinch. She had made her choice. As the priest slit his own palm and let his blood mix with the sacred oils, a deep rumbling echoed through the chamber. The earth trembled beneath her feet, the shadows lengthened, and for the first time in her life, Sahure felt fear not for the men who had fallen before her, not for the weight of her beauty, but for what she was about to become. No sooner had the final words of the incantation left the priest's lips than the temple erupted in chaos. A deafening roar filled the chamber, as if the gods themselves had been roused from their eternal slumber. The torches flared violently, their flames turning an unnatural blue, casting eerie shadows against the stone walls. A sudden wind howled through the temple, though no doors had been opened, and the sacred statues of the gods trembled upon their pedestals. Then came the voices, thousands of them, overlapping, whispering, screaming. The gods were watching. The gods were angry. The ground cracked beneath Sahure's feet, and from the fissures, golden light poured out, blinding her. "This is not meant for mortals." A voice thundered through the void, shaking the very foundation of the temple. The high priest fell to his knees, his body racked with tremors. Sahure gasped as an unseen force pressed against her, testing, judging. The ritual was not hers alone to claim. The gods would decide if she was worthy. And if they deemed her unfit, she would not live to see another sunrise. Through the blinding light, a figure emerged on Sahure knew too well. Seth, the only man who had ever looked at her without hunger, without madness, stood before her, his face etched with sorrow. He had always loved her from the shadows, offering quiet companionship where others offered obsession. Now, He held a dagger in his hands, its blade gleaming in the unnatural light. "The gods demand balance," he whispered. "To gain eternity, a soul must be given in return." Sahure's breath caught. She stepped forward, shaking her head. "Not you," she pleaded, but Seth only smiled. His eyes filled with something deeper than devotion acceptance. "If I must die so that you may live freely," he murmured, "then my life is well spent." Before she could stop him, before she could scream, he drove the blade into his own heart. A shockwave of power erupted from his body, consuming the temple in light. Sahure collapsed, his name on her lips, his sacrifice etched forever into the very core of her soul. As the light faded, the temple fell into eerie silence. Sahure rose to her feet, but something was different. The weight of her curse, the unbearable force that had ensnared men's souls, was gone. She felt it, an absence where once there had been an inescapable pull. Yet, as she looked at her hands, her reflection in the broken temple floor, she realized the gods had not freed her. They had transformed her. Her beauty was no longer mortal, no longer something that could fade with time or be altered by grief. It was eternal, untouched by age, by death. She was no longer bound by the desires of men, but neither was she bound by life itself. The gods had granted her what she sought, freedom, but the cost was far greater than she had ever imagined. As she stepped out of the ruined temple, the stars above burned brighter, colder. Sahure was no longer a woman. She was a legend, a goddess, a queen without end. Centuries passed, yet Sahure remained unchanged. Dynasties rose and fell. Empires crumbled into dust, but she walked through time untouched, her beauty frozen in eternity. Kings and conquerors sought her, each believing they would be the one to claim the goddess who walked among mortals. But they all met the same fated desire turned to obsession, devotion to ruin. Some built temples in her honor, offering their kingdoms at her feet. Others waged wars in her name, their armies crushed beneath the weight of their own madness. Sahure stood above it all, watching as time swallowed those who sought her, leaving nothing but their names etched in forgotten stone. She was worshipped as a deity, a divine queen whose presence was both a blessing and a curse. But beneath the silks and gold, beneath the worship and fear, she remained what she had always been, a woman trapped in a fate she had never chosen, longing for something she could never have. One night, beneath a sky unfamiliar to her, Sahure stood before a pool of still water and gazed upon her own reflection. The same face stared back at her, the same perfect, untouchable beauty that had once been her prison. But now she saw it for what it truly was, a mask of eternity, a curse that time could never break. She touched her face, but no warmth met her fingertips. She had outlived love, outlived sorrow, outlived the very world that had once tried to possess her. And in that moment, she understood. The gods had given her what she asked for, but not what she had wanted. Her beauty was no longer a curse to others, it was a curse to herself, a reminder of all she had lost, a key not to freedom, but to an eternity of solitude. And so she turned away, vanishing into the endless night, a queen without end.